This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett, and today I'm joined by a man who's written more episodes of Star Trek than anyone else in history. It's Brannon Braga. Hi Brannon, how are you?
I'm great. Great to talk to you.
It's good to talk to you as well. There's so much that we could talk about in terms of your contribution to Star Trek, obviously the amount of Star Trek you've been involved in. I kind of wanted to zero in a little bit in this episode to talk about an intersection between your work on Star Trek and some of your other passions and your other kind of creative projects. And that's to talk a little bit about horror. And I know that horror is something that's very important to you, and that in recent years, and even, right now, kind of as we speak, is something that you've been working on quite a lot.
Absolutely.
I understand you've just finished directing your first feature film, and it's a horror film. Is that right? Yeah,
it's called Books of Blood. It's based on Clive Barker's anthology series of books. It was published in the mid-'80s in England initially, and I was always a huge fan of those books, and have had the great privilege of working directly with Clive on creating a really cool anthological film. We're calling it kind of like the Pulp Fiction of horror. 3 stories that kind of transect it. It's cool.
Kind of like those Black Mirror episodes. Have you ever seen those episodes of Black Mirror where they do a kind of anthology thing within the story, but they manage to make them all tie into one thing?
Yeah, kind of like that's a good analogy, except that this is more of a movie style. But it was a ton of fun, and it's always been my dream to direct a horror film. So this was a blast.
You've done quite a lot of horror directing already, I guess, on Salem, the show that you were executive producing and writing and directing as well. So I guess that must have been a good kind of training ground for working on Books of Blood.
Well, Salem, which I created with Adam Simon, who has a very strong horror background in features he himself directed. That was just an orgy of horror. I mean, it was horror fans' horror show. Like, it had so much great stuff in it and so many homages to different horror subgenres. And I thought I got it all out of my system, but apparently not. But that show, if there are any horror fans out there right now, check out Salem if you haven't seen it already. It's 3 seasons. It's a complete story arc from beginning to end, and it's a lot of fun.
Absolutely. I mean, I only had a chance to catch a few episodes, and I have to say horror is not a genre that I'm hugely familiar with. I probably have a kind of average sort of layperson's interest in the genre, if you know what I mean, but it's not something that I'm really passionate about. But I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the episodes I watched. It is pretty full on. I mean, it strikes me kind of looking at that and then going back and looking at some of your Star Trek work, where obviously, in many episodes, I think we could talk about where you've managed to bring horror elements in. But obviously Star Trek Trek, even with the fact that now, as it's come back with Discovery and Picard and so on, it's kind of been pushing boundaries a little bit. I don't think it's ever going to push the kind of gore and horror and shock value in your face in the way that you have in Salem. I mean, in one episode, you literally had a child who is, as I understand it, kind of the devil incarnated, is having to transform into an adult, and the adult kind of comes out from inside the child's body and rips its head off. I mean, you couldn't do this kind of thing on Star Trek, I guess. This is, this is pretty out there.
Yeah, that was all done with practical effects. My homage to the great transformation sequences from the 80s, The Howling and American Werewolf in London and The Thing. And I'm surprised we got away with it on cable TV. It's pretty graphic. I mean, like this would be rated R in a movie. TV is really the medium pushing boundaries right now. But I always had from an early age an interest in horror, and an interest in science fiction. And only as I got involved in Star Trek, did I capitalize on the subgenre of sci-fi horror, which, you can trace back to writers like H.P. Lovecraft, or H.G. Wells, who had horror elements in his sci-fi tales. And, because Next Generation, which I started on, I just had to look at as an anthology show where you could kind of tell any kind of story. So I saw opportunities to tell the kinds of stories that I wanted to explore with those characters, which was great and great fun. And I thought really, we had a really talented group of writers. I'm not including myself in that. I was doing my best to keep up with people like Ron Moore and Michael Piller and Jerry Taylor. But, we all had our interests, and the kinds of stories we like to tell. And so the brilliance of Gene Roddenberry's concept was that you could do anything. And Seth MacFarlane and I are kind of continuing that tradition on the Orville, where you don't know what you're going to get every week. It's a different kind of story. And in season 3 of Orville, which will be on Hulu at some date when this pandemic's over, there's a great horror episode. I think there's one in season 1 as well that I directed, actually, that has a creepy clown in it. And the Next Generation, I think there was some good scary stuff in there. I don't know if it holds up, but it certainly was fun to do at the time.
I would say absolutely it does. I mean, obviously you can't, as I say, you can't push things as much as you can with something like Salem, or as much as you can with a horror movie. But some of those episodes, I was watching Schisms last night. That episode never fails to set the hairs on my arms tingling. Particularly that one scene, that scene you wrote with they're reconstructing this table in the holodeck, and everyone's sort of trying to remember this thing that's that they've experienced, but is a kind of, I suppose, almost sort of repressed memory, or a kind of, forgotten memory. And there's something just really chilling about the way that scene is constructed. And it's not like a horror movie. It's not like the kind of gore and in your face of it. I suppose that's it's a sort of psychological horror. But even within the framework of Next Gen, which, can feel like quite a kind of safe, comfortable, cozy group of people, a kind of environment, it's sort of comfort TV for a lot of us, I think. And the Orville, I suppose, kind of capitalizes on that feeling and that kind of nostalgia for that comfort feeling. And yet you can do something like that where suddenly it's like the temperature has dropped in the room. You can have that kind of real chilling psychological kind of shock value in a way.
Yeah, and Schisms, the drag about that episode, I felt, was that when you finally see the aliens, they're just disappointing to me. It's like the director, I can't remember who did it. It might have been Corey Allen or Cliff Bowler, one of our go-to directors, did the best they could. But I didn't like the aliens. But certainly that set piece of this kind of Whitley Strieber type of alien abduction thing that was still relatively new at the time was chill. I'd use the word chilling, and particularly for this group of explorers who you're not used. I think the closest to horror before then that I detected probably was when they first encountered the Borg. You really got a sense of scary stuff. But this was flat out, psychological horror. And that's the horror I like the best. I would always prefer to a movie like Halloween, 1978's Halloween, to 1980's Friday the 13th, because Halloween was psychological and Friday the 13th was gore. So I don't think the best horror is bloody at all.
It's the creep factor more than the slasher. And I suppose you don't get that many, although you do get a slasher moment in Phantasms, I think it is, where Data is kind of stalking Troy, and there's even a shot in there that it's almost like it's been taken out of Psycho, with Data with this. It's not a knife; it's a kind of engineering tool that he's using as a knife, and he's stabbing her with it.
Yeah, that's definitely was also pretty creepy, and that got into kind of surrealism. And dream imagery, which can be quite frightening as well.
It's another episode that I think really pushes that crew. I mean, if anything, you might say the Next Generation crew, they're a very kind of super ego driven, sort of well-defined, well in control of themselves kind of group of people. And it's quite nice in a way to see these episodes sometimes that turn all of that on its head and kind of create sort of chaos, I suppose. And in that episode, it's very much the unconscious is the kind of return of the repressed. It's all this sort of weird stuff coming out. And I think there are, some quite freaky elements in there that are quite effective, within the scope of, what's possible to put on TV, especially what's possible to put on TV in the 90s and, to get away with. I'm kind of curious, though, were there ever things where you felt like it was there was a limitation placed on sort of how far you could go, or where you had to rewrite something because it was too gruesome or too kind of heavy? Did you ever have to rein it in, knowing that you were writing for Star Trek at the time?
Not to my recollection. We had a tremendous amount of creative freedom. I think as long as you were true to the characters and the ethos of Star Trek, and that you weren't just doing gruesome or scary stuff just for the sake of doing it. I mean, there's an intricate story happening in Phantasms where the surreal imagery actually all holds a clue to a mystery as to what's really happening. But I never really was reined in. I mean, I knew if they couldn't figure out how to do something that I was on the right track. How are we going to turn Troy into a cake? If I could throw the production team make them, work harder to try to figure something out, I knew we were doing something new. Of course, that's the oldest magician's trick in the book, the fake table with her underneath. But no, I never felt, in my 15 years on Star Trek, I don't think I ever was told to tone something down. Because, it still had to be an episode of Star Trek. And there's certainly, you're only going to get so bloody. When Data attacks Troy, it's pretty tame. I don't even know if you see any blood at all. So there was just a certain way things were done that wasn't too graphic. It's funny. I think of another really blatant horror movie, a creature feature of sorts, was an episode called Genesis. I think it might have been season 7, where the crew is de-evolving into various creatures, which should not work. It should not work. But Gates McFadden did a great job directing it. And, that's a creature feature, man. That's a haunted house creature feature. And it has some scary, Barclay as the spider is kind of scary, certainly at the time. And it's always kind of has a science fictional element to it to give it a little whiff of believability. In that case, a very, very faint whiff. And I think that always kind of grounded the horror a little bit. We weren't dealing with supernatural. We weren't dealing with psychopaths or some of the other traditional elements of horror. It always had a science fiction aspect to it. So again, it's science fiction horror, which is kind of its own thing.
It's interesting. You pointed out it's basically a haunted house story. And one of the things that makes that work is that you take Picard and Data away and then kind of bring them back. And the Enterprise, which is normally very brightly lit and kind of clean, has in their absence sort of, the lights have gone off. It's kind of, it has become this kind of spooky environment. There's almost a sense you kind of have to transform the environment of Star Trek in order to tell these stories to some extent. You have to be able to make it dark and kind of grungy and dirty. And, in other episodes, I don't know, something like Macrocosm, you've got kind of goo oozing out of things. All this kind of clean sort of design utopianism, in a sense, that I guess you have in Star Trek has to be sort of stripped away, and it has to get kind of dark and grungy and dirty. Or even in First Contact, you have to have the Borg literally transforming the ship into this kind of house of horrors where the temperature's higher and it's all a bit sweaty and a bit kind of dark and disgusting somehow.
Yeah, well, that's the idea. I liked doing that, changing the ship. I did that a lot on Voyager too. I think at one point I even froze the ship under ice, and it would really piss off the production designers because, once you freeze the bridge over, you've got to clean it up too. But it's fun to do that. It's fun to transform the ship into, a creepy place.
Does your experience now as a director, I mean, particularly in relation to horror, but I guess just generally as well, affect how you now go back and write these scenes? I mean, in a sense, if you're the writer, sort of saying, right, I can write this, it's someone else's problem to work out how to realize it. That's one thing. But if you might be the one who ends up actually having to direct it, does that feed into it? Or does having the kind of director's mindset, does that come back in when you're writing? Or are those two very different sort of hats that you're wearing?
I think it's the latter. I've always written, my scripts tend to be pretty specifically visual. I'm not calling shots out. Sometimes I am. But I think I've always written from a very strong visual place, a directorial place. And whether I'm the one doing it or not, I don't worry when I'm writing how to do things. I want to make it the best story. And then when you're in pre-production on an episode, then you start thinking, okay, well, we can't do that. So we need to figure something else out. But I don't like to rein myself in while I'm writing too much. Then you're just, handcuffing your imagination. And that's the freedom time, when you're thinking stuff up. And you'd be surprised, what these amazing artists and craftspeople can accomplish. They like to be challenged.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think, something like Genesis, you're right. It's an episode, the kind of concept behind it is slightly balmy from a kind of sciencey point of view, I suppose, but it's very effective the way that it works. It's, and the makeup and all of that stuff is brilliant, I'd say.
Michael Westmore, going to town, he's going to turn Barclay into a spider, and it's a great makeup. And he loved it. He gets more money for his budget that week.
Yeah,
and he's not doing a little forehead thingy this week. That was a real fun thing for him to do.
And you've got also that kind of, I mean, it's a real sort of horror moment in a way when Barclay pops up, because it's not just a lot of the crew, we sort of see them having been transformed in various ways, but Barclay gets the kind of, he literally sort of pops up from the floor, if you know what I mean. Picard is kind of walking towards the warp core, I think it is, isn't it? And he's sort of peering towards it, and then he just pops up out of nowhere, and it's a kind of, it's a sort of shock. What do you call it? It's kind of a horror trope in a way, that the sort of bang, the kind of loud noise, a jump scare.
And, it's kind of, I used to think that those were cheap scares, but in fact, they're hard to pull off. I guess a loud sound can startle anybody, but you gotta, at their best, they're coupled with a disturbing image. And I think that was a really effective one. I'm not sure there were a whole lot of scary moments like that on Next Gen. There was an episode that Jerry Taylor wrote called Night Terrors. I was in the story break for that, but she wrote it, and that has to me the scariest Next Gen scene when the bodies come to life in the morgue. That to me was super creepy. And then, I often see, I know this is going to sound strange, I see time travel stories as horror stories, in that they're all kind of about death. If we were a species that lived for thousands of years or hundreds of years, time travel stories wouldn't be all that interesting to us. It's because of the finite nature of our existence that the stories become interesting. And you can look at a story like Remember Me, where the crew is vanishing, is kind of a terrifying story.
It's a sort of psychological horror in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, and I, as weird as this might sound, there was a time loop episode I did called Cause and Effect, which is kind of an existential horror story. Like it's, if you are old enough that you can go back and remember seeing it for the first time, it was very trippy. Like people were calling into TV stations, local stations, saying there's something wrong with the broadcast. What more could you hope for? It's like Outer Limits. Don't touch your TV set. Like that's psychological horror, man. Like what the hell is happening?
Well, it's almost like a kind of version of hell as well, isn't it? Dying over and over and over again. There is something in that.
That's filled with horror kind of things, like hearing voices whispering, and that Beverly hears, and a very eerie sense of deja vu, and the knowledge that you're going to keep dying. That's a horror story. It's a sci-fi horror story, without question.
And I guess in a way, a lot of what horror kind of draws from is to do with our preoccupation with mortality and death and decay. I mean, a lot of horror involves, corpses one way or another. And we get that in Star Trek as well. I mean, even I was looking at Equinox recently, the way those aliens, they turn when they kill people, they sort of turn them into like old dead bodies as if they've sort of almost been exhumed or something. And you get that in Timescape as well. I mean, talking about time and horror having that weird connection. There's that horrific moment in Timescape where Picard goes to touch the fruit and his hand sort of ages, dramatically in front of him, and it's incredibly painful, and he kind of screams as well. There is something about that kind of, and obviously Star Trek's done lots of like premature aging, kind of, people aging very quickly kind of episodes. And obviously that does tap into this fear of, our own mortality and our own sort of decay one way or another.
Body horror is a subgenre of horror that has always interested me. And I think that hand moment with the long fingernails and we didn't have CGI, so we really couldn't. I think today we probably would have shown it age. But it's still pretty scary thanks to some cool makeup and Patrick's performance. And body horror, I think in Star Trek really culminates with the Borg. There's this the strong body horror aspect to them. They assimilate you and they stick tubes in you and turn you into something else, sever limbs, poke your eyes out, and take away any trace of your individuality. And I think that it's part of the reason that the Borg, on a conceptual level, were popular. I think it's more than that they were cybernetic, so they're cybernetic zombies, and I thought they got even more horrific when the Borg Queen was introduced, who's kind of this vampiric character, her introduction as a torso. I mean, that's a horrormovie.
It is. She's almost like a kind of decapitated. It's like part of a body. That's it. Even the way she's introduced, it's kind of not a complete body. So there's something very unsettling about that.
It's like she crawled out of a coffin. The torso emerges and the head. In fact, that image, what inspired that image for me was a movie called The Thing That Wouldn't Die, which was a 1950s American film about a woman who is is decapitated in a car crash, and a scientist who's able to keep her head alive in his lab. And she has a little skull cap on. And if you look at the image and that gave me really bad recurring nightmares as a child. And if you look at the image from that movie, you'll see the correlation with the introduction of the Borg Queen as a disembodied head and torso. So that's right out of a horror movie.
And I mean, First Contact is essentially a horror movie, I would say. I mean, you've got all the kind of horror tropes are in there. You've got, I mean, when you were saying about those kind of jump scares, you've got one of those actually in sickbay, the great shot where Dr. Crusher is sort of walking backwards towards the door, and then suddenly these Borg start kind of trying to smash the door down behind her, and she jumps. You've got that amazing, the woman who dies in the Jeffries tube, where she goes up looking for her friend or whatever, and you just see her face kind of screaming as the Borg come and get her. I mean, I think it's very effective. You know, obviously it's a film that is beloved on many levels, but it works very well as a horror movie. I'm kind of curious, at what point when you were sort of pitching that idea, you know, to Rick Berman or to the Paramount or whoever it was, did you realize from the very beginning that you were essentially making a Star Trek horror movie when you were coming up with this idea? Or was that something that sort of fed into it gradually as you sort of looked to, well, what can the Borg bring to this?
Well, I don't know that we ever thought we were making a horror movie. We knew we were making a movie that was really about the birth of Star Trek. And that we knew that we wanted to make the Borg more intense for the big screen. That we could bring a greater level of intensity. We could redesign them and make them cooler. There's no question that once the Borg start assimilating the Enterprise, you're in a haunted house. And we were quite aware that that's the feeling we wanted to create. And there's this, one of my favorite moments in the movie is when Data's feeling anxiety and is able to turn off his chip, his motion chip, and Picard says, I envy you sometimes. That's a great moment, but it also creates anxiety in the audience. If Data's nervous, then you better be worried.
It's really bad, yeah.
But I don't think we set out to make a horror movie per se, but there are definitely horror elements in it, and Jonathan Frakes approached a lot of the shots that way. He did Borg POVs, which is kind of a horror thing, The Stalker. We shot a sequence. We wanted to up the scare quotient. When we previewed the first cut, we realized we needed some more Borgification type stuff. So there's a montage in there of Borg with lasers in the darkness and people without limbs being Borgified. And that was a sequence we wrote and shot after the movie was cut together to kind of show the horrors a little bit more. And we hired actors with no arms, and we hired an actor with a glass eye that we could put a Borg eye into. And there's some real body horror in that in those shots.
And the film even opens. I mean, the very first shot of the film, you have this kind of, the sort of zooming out from Picard and so on. But then you have this scene that I found. I mean, I remember seeing it in the cinema and being scared by it. But this kind of dream within a dream, this nightmare within a nightmare, which I think is another element of horror that is genuinely very scary. This idea that you might not know whether something is real or not. So you have, Picard seemingly waking up from his nightmare and then going to wash his face, and again, the kind of body horror thing, this thing erupting from his face, and then suddenly waking up a second time, and you're like, oh, that was the nightmare. And it's a trick I noticed you use again in Enterprise with T'Pol in the Impulse, the kind of zombie Vulcan episode. At the end, there's a scene where it seems like it's all okay, and then in fact, it turns out she's having a nightmare, and it all goes awful, and then she wakes up for real.
Recycling my old ideas that are already recycled from other people. Another thing that was good about the First Contact movie was we could do a Borg appendage erupting from Picard's skin. That's just not something we could afford to do on the TV show, and that ILM could do for us really well. So, and it, certainly at the time felt more violent and graphic than we might have wanted to do on the TV show, And in fact, I remember the film. I have the poster right here. I want to see what it was rated. I think it was PG-13. Pretty sure the movie got a PG-13, and the reason, and it was interesting to me to see what the MPAA, the ratings board here in America, what got you a rating like that. And I remember initially we got an R rating. And we were like, what? We can't release an R-rated Star Trek movie. And it was a moment when Data breaks a Borg's neck.
I've always thought that's quite dark for Star Trek, a moment.
Apparently, that gets you an R rating. For certain things that are at the time in the 90s, mid-90s, like the F word, any kind of nudity, automatic. Nowadays, not so much, but and the breaking of a neck, which was like, And I think what we did, we recut it to be a little briefer and less graphic. Data breaking the neck of someone is not something that you would see every day. So the movie had just a higher level of intensity than an average episode, I think. And sometimes intensity is what horror is all about.
It is, definitely, I think. And I mean, and the movie manages to hold together. I always think it's very impressive, these two storylines, these kind of parallel storylines, one which is so intense and so dark and kind of gruesome, and then one which is much more comedic and lighter and gentler and so on. And somehow it doesn't feel jarring, that you can have these two stories running along in parallel. I always think it's quite impressive how seamlessly that those two elements of the film kind of blend together.
Well, there are three stories, really. You're forgetting the Data Borg Queen story.
Of course, yeah, that's true. But I mean, I suppose I think of that as at least within the realm of the kind of gruesome. Do you know what I mean? You got the stuff on the ship and the stuff on the ground. But you're right. There's three plots going on, I suppose. Yeah.
There's Picard and Lily and the crew. There's Data and the Queen, and then there's the story on the surface. And the Data one is the closest thing we have to kind of a seduction, a very twisted one. And there's a psychosexual component to the Queen that was, would have probably been a little too racy for the television show at the time, where we pushed some boundaries. She gives him. There's some sexual imagery there.
She gives him a blowjob, basically. That's what you were going to say, right?
Say it, but
but that's the joke, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting. I mean, sexuality is obviously quite a core component of horror as a genre. I mean, there's a reason a lot of horror films focus on groups of teenagers who are kind of becoming sort of sexual beings to some extent. There's a kind of link there between death and violence and sex, basically, that I suppose it is runs throughout so much of horror. And in a way, it makes sense that when Star Trek goes horror in First Contact, that the Borg, the more horrific they get, suddenly you get this Queen who is this very disconcerting, strange mixture of being quite horrific and also very seductive at the same time. And it is a sexy performance as much as she's quite sort of repulsive but sexy at the same time, if you know what I mean.
Alice Krieger, she's what I call creepy sexy, sexy creepy, take your pick. And I had really loved her in the movie Ghost Story from I think 1980. She was very much creepy sexy in that movie, and I think I was the one who suggested her for the role. There were other actresses considered, but I'm like, you're not going to find anybody who can pull off what she'll be able to pull off in this role. And yeah, I mean, I called her vampiric. There's a seduction going on, and yeah, it's interesting.
One of the other things that I think works very well in the movie is that in order to kind of play up this kind of haunted house thing, you have Lily in the role of the kind of I was going to say like the Scream Queen. She's the one. She screams a lot in the film, and and she's a tough character. She's not a wimp, but at the same time, understandably, she's been transported into this horrific environment, which is frankly terrifying. And so you get a lot of, as well as you say, those kind of POV shots of the Borg kind of stalking people, but you also get in at least one of those a great shot of Lily kind of screaming in the face of a Borg. So you've kind of got that element. And it sort of struck me looking back at some of these other Star Trek episodes that you've written that kind of draw on horror. You often do have someone who kind of falls into the role, the sort of Scream Queen role, whether it's, Troy being stalked, or even in Phantasms, you've got the solution is Data has to scream at these creatures in order to kind of get rid of them. And in Genesis, weirdly, you've got Picard in that role because he is regressing in this way that he becomes quite timid and scared, and he still has to act anyway, but he becomes the sort of weak hero, if you know what I mean, which I suppose on some level is kind of a horror trope that someone who finds the inner strength, but physically they're quite weak. They're not necessarily they're overpowered physically, if you know what I mean, but they're kind of and they're terrified, but they're going to get on with it anyway.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in the case of Lily, she was our POV character for everything in the movie, really, and was an absolutely essential character to understanding. She was a surrogate for the audience. There was a reason that movie really appealed to an audience that went beyond Star Trek, which is always your goal, and but as far as the horror goes, yeah, it was fun to, what would a person like you or me think about these crazy creatures running around?
Because I guess horror movies, they do put ordinary people in a really awful situation like that. They're not typically focused on kind of sort of naturally heroic types, whereas Star Trek, most of the characters in Star Trek we sort of see as quite heroic, as kind of better than us, if you know what I mean. Whereas I suppose a typical horror movie, it does, it is like a group of teenagers. It is like a group of ordinary people. I'm kind of curious whether that affects. I noticed, say, in Schisms and Frame of Mind, you've got two episodes that do quite, in some ways, quite similar things to Riker. Really push that character. Are there some characters sort of within Star Trek that you feel lend themselves to the kind of to being victimized by horror, if you know what I mean, in those episodes? Is there a link between the character and the story that you can kind of craft for them?
Well, in the case of Riker, yes. I don't think Frame of Mind, which is a psychological horror story, or without for sure, I don't think it would have worked as well with Picard. I think there's something about Riker that you feel like he's just a little more relatable, a little more like a person from today. And, Picard is just so, look what it took to break down Picard. It took a 2-part episode where he's being tortured the entire time. Like, you don't break Picard, that quick. But there was always a little bit of a unexplored aspect to Riker and a vulnerability that I detected in Riker, and certainly I felt the actor I just felt like Frakes was a really good actor who deserved a little more to do, and so yes, I picked Riker for a reason for both of those episodes.
And Frame of Mind is definitely an episode that gives him a lot to do. I mean, I'd say that is sort of going to be anyone's sort of top 5 Riker episodes, because it is psychologically scary. He also gives a brilliant performance as, not just Riker, but Riker acting in the play in a nightmare where it's not really the play. Do you know what I mean? Like, you've given him quite a lot of layers and levels to play within that one story.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And he was great. And the director, Jim Conway, did a great job with it. And, it was really fun. It was fun to watch Frakes really sink his teeth into all that. And though I would argue Second Chances was a good Riker episode where you got 2 Rikers for the price of one.
That's true. Yeah, another good one. Definitely. And a different kind of, I mean, not psychological horror, but a kind of, a horrific situation for any of us to find ourselves in anyway.
Equal twin, maybe. Yeah. Equal twin type of thing.
I guess so. I mean, I'm interested. Sometimes some of these, obviously there is a link between, you can kind of, being out in space would be kind of scary. There is a kind of link between horror and sci-fi. There are films like Alien, there are films like Event Horizon even that really kind of make that link. But I'd say some of these stories within Star Trek, they draw even from other areas than that kind of obvious connection, if you know what I mean. One of the things that struck me is a couple of episodes that you worked on that kind of pull on this idea of paedophobia, I guess, or like really freaky, scary children, basically. And I noticed that I read an interview that you'd given, I can't remember what the website was, but about your sort of favourite scary movies. And one of them was a film about, I think it was an adaptation of The Turn of the Screw, about these kind of creepy children. And I'm kind of curious, in Imaginary Friend, for example, and then again in Voyager with Cold Fire. I was going to say Cold Fury. That's mixing two episodes together. With the episode Cold Fire in Voyager, you've got this idea again of the kind of creepy little girl, which I guess again sort of ties a little bit into The Exorcist and in Salem having the devil as this young boy and so on. But what is it, do you think, that is so that makes these children who aren't children so sort of unsettling? And how did you find kind of porting that into Star Trek? Did you find that was an easy match?
Well, the movie you're referencing is called The Innocents, Deborah Carr, and directed by Jack Clayton. One of my favorite movies of all time, and it is based on Turn of the Screw by Henry James, and about a woman who thinks that these two children that she's a nanny watching these two kids who may or may not be possessed by two dead, extremely perverted, evil caretakers that used to live there. And these kids are either truly possessed, or Deborah Carr, a sexually repressed kind of spinster, is losing her mind. And I think that movie, more than anything, inspired in me the kind of story where someone's losing their grip on reality. And that's a Frame of Mind episode.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting point, that those two things are bundled together in that story.
Yeah, creepy kids is a grand tradition. I hesitate to use Imaginary Friend as anything successful. I don't really like that episode. It was the first rewrite I ever did. The first rewrite I did with Ron Moore, Reunion. It was my second rewrite, and I never really liked that story. I did my best with it, but I wished it turned out better, because having a creepy imaginary friend is not a bad idea. And
the girl is quite, I find her quite freaky. I think the actress does quite a good job of that sort of cold, slightly psychopathic. It's not about. I mean, you sort of might worry about with child performers getting them to get what you need, but I feel like she does a pretty decent job of that.
Yeah, and I don't think I populated Star Trek with a lot of creepy kids. Certainly, I can't remember. I'm so embarrassed to say I barely remember Cold Fire.
Cold Fire, I'll refresh your memory then, because I had to go back and watch it this week. I hadn't seen it for a while. But it's the episode where they find the second caretaker. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about it is, so it's an episode that's been anticipated ever since the pilot, in that there's been this, they know there's this female caretaker, and at some point we're going to find her and maybe she'll send us home or whatever. And I was just kind of curious, because it seems like a very out of left field decision to turn that into an episode with all these kind of horror trappings, because obviously the pilot caretaker didn't really have any of that. it had some experiments and so on, but the caretaker seemed like this kind of benign godlike figure that you kind of get in Star Trek from time to time. Whereas when you get to Cold Fire, you've got the female caretaker, we find out is called Suspiria, so she's named after a horror film. You've got Kes doing all this telekinetic stuff where she burns Tuvok's face, and then there's a kind of Carrie moment where she's sort of surrounded by flames. I think it feels to me anyway like there's a kind of Carrie storyline for Kes going on there with her telekinesis. And then you've got the female caretaker, when she appears as this little girl in a pink dress, but with a older woman's voice. And I was just kind of curious at what point, maybe you won't remember if your memory of it is hazy, but at what point and who was it who said, I know what we're going to do for this story that's been anticipated for a year and a half. We're going to go horror with it, because that's what it feels like. It feels like someone's decided, okay, we're going to do this episode we've been waiting for, but we're not going to do it the way anyone's expecting. We're going to do something quite different with it.
Well, what's nutty is I wrote the episode, and it was season 2, episode 10, and what you're describing sounds cool. This is one of the rare cases where I really have a vague recollection of. Oh yeah, Gary Graham was in it.
He plays the Acampa guy who wants Kes to stay with them. But one of the things that's quite striking about it is that it doesn't. It's like one of those episodes. It starts off quite sort of sci-fi, and then it kind of goes in a different direction, like about halfway through. But it sort of struck me, even the decision to call the character Suspiria. It all seems quite innocent up until that point. They're like, oh yeah, you'll have to meet our caretaker Suspiria. And as the viewer, you're sort of thinking, oh, okay, where's this going to go? This, suddenly it sounds like we're heading somewhere sinister.
God, this is terrible. I wonder if I have Alzheimer's disease.
Well, you have written, haven't you written, I think, how many episodes of Star Trek have you written, Brannon? It's like 100 and something, isn't it? I mean, it's a good excuse.
Credited on 100 plus, and then I'm sure I did another 50 to 100 rewrites. I would actually have to count it up. But Suspiria is no doubt, I named her that after the Dario Argento picture. And there was definitely, as I recall, I wanted to do kind of a Carrie thing with Kes. But I would have to watch the episode again because I just don't remember it quite enough. I don't remember the caretaker aspect of it. So, but there's no question that I was doing something with horror there.
Well, let me ask you about another Voyager episode and see if it's comes to mind. The Vedians, we were talking about body horror, and obviously with the Delta Quadrant, you've got this opportunity to invent new villains, and it seems to me like the Vedians are basically the body horror villain for Star Trek, and you got to do Phage, which was the episode that introduced them and kind of established that. That must have been quite an interesting one in a way to, every time you get a chance to bring in a new villain that you presumably hope at least is going to be a recurring one, and to focus in this case on that quite specific thing that is so repulsive and revolting and horrifying.
Well, yeah, I mean, 100% the Vedians were a horror show. Early in Voyager, a show that was promising that a ship was being catapulted to an unexplored region of space, which technically was every week on Next Gen. But that aside, I felt that there was a promise to the audience that there was a bit of an X-Files to this Star Trek incarnation, that it should be extra scary out there at times. So the Vedians were an attempt early on, I believe it was early in season 1, that episode, with these frightening looking creatures who steal Neelix's lungs, which is pretty awful. But with this tragic backstory of a species who has been living with, a plague or pandemic that never went away. And what would happen to their society if this flesh-eating plague just decimate? To me, it was an interesting concept. And, but stealing body parts from other species is pretty much as horror as you can get. And I was really happy with the way they looked, and I was really happy with the way they would come back a couple more times in the series.
Well, there's the episode, I don't think it was one of yours, but you might remember it, the episode Faces, where B'Elanna is divided into the human and Klingon by the Vedians, has what I would say is probably the most horrific moment in probably the whole of Star Trek, where you've got the Vedian scientist who takes the face of one of the Voyager crewmen and puts it, surgically grafts it onto his own face, and suddenly sort of reveals himself with this new face proudly. That's a moment that I sort of still find almost surprising that you could get away with in Star Trek in the 90s, because it's so it's such a horrific idea, but it's also just a sort of visually very shocking bit of makeup and kind of effect, really.
Yeah, that was a great makeup job. And there was an episode I did called Deadlock, where the Vedians show up at the worst possible moment toward the end of the episode. And you invented a good species when just the mention of their name evokes a certain feeling of tension and dread. And so that definitely was a successful alien. Probably should have seen a little more of them, but yeah, you're making me feel like everything I contributed had some.
I think there are other takes. Most people, in my experience, when your name comes up, it's the more kind of the sort of high concept, or the sort of slightly out there kind of concepts in a way. But I mean, it just struck me when I was looking through your, kind of episography on Memory Alpha. I was like, wow, yeah, there are quite a lot. Because I knew that you were doing this Books of Blood. I knew that you'd been working on Salem and so on. And I thought, oh yeah, there are more of these are kind of horror inflected episodes than I'd sort of realised. Which is why I was sort of wondering, was that an agenda, or is it just that that's kind of how it fell out? Did you sort of feel, right, I'm gonna sneak as much horror into Star Trek as I can?
Well, horror inflected is a great phrase, and it's an accurate one, in that sometimes these stories weren't out and out horror, but as you said earlier, space can be a scary place at times, and a mysterious and sometimes terrifying place filled with unknowns. And I just think horror, I like the phrase horror inflected, because it implies a sensibility. And sometimes, if I guess in my case, horror is just part of my creative sensibility or creative DNA. It's probably going to manifest in some way in everything I do, which is fine.
Well, I noticed actually in 2 of the Next Gen episodes that we've mentioned, Frame of Mind and Phantasms, you have versions of the same kind of conversation. First of all with Riker, and then again with Data, basically saying, I'm being plagued by this nightmare imagery, which I think is the phrase, disturbing images. I wrote it down. You call it disturbing images in Frame of Mind and nightmare imagery in Phantasms, which very much could be a description of what horror is, sort of as a genre. And in both those episodes, you've got Troy basically saying to them, don't be afraid of that. Explore that. Don't suppress that. Do you know what I mean? Kind of making quite a strong statement in a way, saying this is part of what it means to be human. This is part of us. We shouldn't shy away from those things.
Yeah, it's I believe a Jungian, Carl Jung phrase, owning your shadow. Yeah, I gave a little speech to Troy about that.
And you've got Jung in Frame of Mind, Troy quoting Jung, and then in Phantasms, of course, you've got Freud himself turning up. Although Troy seems a bit more down on Freud in the episode. She says to Data, come back to me. Don't go and see Sigmund. You can't always trust what Freud's going to tell you. But I suppose it's kind of interesting, this idea that these characters might have these kind of this sort of bubbling unconscious underneath these quite composed exteriors. The unconscious can still be quite dark and gritty and scary, effectively, even when your sort of conscious life and conscious self is so composed and so sort of perfect.
Yeah, that's, by the way, well said. And I think that is why some of these episodes are remembered, is because in the context of Next Generation, when scary stuff like this, psychologically scary stuff like this happened, it was unusual and kind of stood out more. And as long as it was believable that it might happen to these people, it was very effective. It was more effective with these characters than on an ordinary a TV show set in present day.
Now, I'm kind of curious. I don't know how much you've seen of Discovery or the Picard series, but I mean, both of those in various ways have, I think, pushed slightly at what Star Trek can get away with in terms of kind of the age ratings and so on. I mean, both of them, we've had quite a lot of swearing. Both of them have had beheading scenes, which I don't think we've ever had in Star Trek before. I don't think either of them have gone full on horror, though there was a Discovery episode that went pretty kind of Game of Thrones with the Klingons. But I'm sort of curious, do you think, I mean, is there a limit to how far Star Trek should go in these directions? Can do you think Star Trek could go kind of to the depths that you go to in Salem of, this sort of hellish nightmare kind of world? Or do you think Star Trek needs to always pull back a little bit, needs to always slightly have the brakes on that?
I think that, I don't know, it has to have some kind of psychological value. I don't think swearing for swearing's sake or just showing violence. And I haven't seen these episodes that you're describing, but I was always very circumspect about the idea of swearing on Star Trek. I'm not sure what it adds. But
you had Data saying shit.
Yeah.
That was the start of the slope, I think. But there was a good reason for it, and it was funny, I guess.
Well, he had an emotion chip, and he was scared. Yeah. And that was, by the way, a huge deal because it was the first. There may have been one in one of the original series movies. I think there's a shit in there somewhere. But having Data say it was, the whole point of it. I've never made a conscious attempt to depict graphic violence on Star Trek, nor on the Orville. And Salem, yes. But I don't know. It's just not part of what it is to me. I suppose if they're beheading people, there must be a reason for it. But to me, it's not a place I would necessarily go. Then again, I think I'm going to contradict myself completely and utterly. On Enterprise, there was some pretty gruesome stuff. We did push some boundaries with bodies hanging on meat hooks, I think, in an early episode. And certainly the episode Impulse, which is the Vulcan zombie episode, has some pretty cool stuff in it. So I guess I stand corrected. I don't know. I don't know how far you push. I guess you can push Star Trek really far now.
I guess that's what I'm saying is that they certainly can push it farther than you used to be able to if they want to, if you know what I mean. And sometimes it feels like they're trying to prove that a little bit and say, look.
Well, that's what I object to is the arbitrary nature of it. I mean, to me, at the end of the day, and this is just me, this is nobody else I ever worked with, this is not the people doing Star Trek now, it's just my opinion, is that it is still a family show. And all you have to do is go to a Star Trek convention, if there are any more, ever, with this pandemic stuff going on. But all you have to do is go to one of those things and see the families there. This is people pass Star Trek on to their children. People share it with their children. It's a generational thing. And I personally would only go so far. This is just me. Before, I don't think I would want to do Star Trek that couldn't be watched by children because it's too violent or has the F word in it. Like, I don't think that's right. But that's just me.
Well, that's an interesting point, and it kind of brings me on to one last question I was going to ask you. I mean, obviously, we saw with Discovery, I'm sure Joe Menosky came back and wrote, I would say, for my money, the best episode that show has produced so far. Really fantastic episode. I know Terry Matalas is someone who you've worked with in the past, who's now taking over as the showrunner of Picard. I mean, if you got the phone call saying, Brannon, we want you to come back and work on this show, is that something you would be keen to do, or do you sort of feel you're done with Star Trek now and you prefer to focus on other things? Is that a universe that you would still enjoy playing in, I guess?
Well, before the Orville, I never thought I would be doing this kind of storytelling. But the Orville more in the tradition of 90s Star Trek. It's standalone, allegorical science fiction tales. And boy, did I miss that kind of storytelling. I love it so much. I missed being on a starship. The ship of the imagination in Cosmos is great, but doesn't count in the same way. And I really love being back in that kind of universe. And, Star Trek, I mean, I would certainly consider going back to Star Trek. It depend on the show and circumstances, but, in some ways I'm still doing it. It's just with a different crew in a different science fictional universe.
And obviously the Orville has found a real audience, I think. I don't want to draw the distinction too heavily because, I enjoy all of them, if you know what I mean. But I know there are some people who are very sort of anti-discovery who have kind of migrated to the Orville almost. And that, do you know what I mean? It feels like can be quite divisive. I don't think it necessarily needs to be. And Star Trek has different shows that cater to different audiences and different tastes and always has done.
I don't think there's any reason anyone should be disparaging of Discovery or Orville. They're their own things, and there's room for both. You may prefer serialized storytelling or you may prefer the kind of storytelling Orville does. Certainly in modern television, the two are not enemies. And I think there's, I think the biggest distinction may be the ethos of the show, in that Orville is very optimistic and, deeply humanistic and shows more of a kind of a uplifting future. And in a time where most television's pretty grim. And even Discovery, which is a beautifully produced show, is a little darker than we might be used to, both in tone and literally. I think I think Star Trek endures, and we're still talking about it today because of what Gene created, which was a future we want to be in. No matter how dark or horrific the episode, at the end of the day, it's still a place we would love to be and love to be included. And to me, that's one of the most important things. And even the scariest episodes that I worked on have a happy ending for the most part. They get out of it.
Yeah, and I guess that's, part of the kind of horror story, I suppose, is about survival, isn't it? There are all these awful things that happen to people, but you don't generally get a horror film where no one survives to the end. The character that you're following is the one who makes it through against the odds. So there is sort of hope at the end on one level. There may be the hand creeping up out of the grave in the final shot or whatever, but there is a kind of a happy ending or a hopeful ending or an escape, I suppose. And that's part of the catharsis of it.
Definitely. Not always, but you do typically want some kind of relief, at the end.
You want the monster to be, blown up or destroyed or whatever ultimately, don't you? That's the kind of...
Yeah, for now, anyway.
Yeah, until the sequel. Well, Brannon, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you and going over some of these darker entries in your, Star Trek filmography, even some of the obscure ones that, maybe...
so obscure.
You haven't thought about for a good few years.
I know. If any of our listeners want to try and continue the conversation online, where's the best place for them to find you? They can find you on Twitter, is that right?
I think... For me, probably Instagram or Twitter or Facebook. I'm on all three. I certainly probably the best place to have a written conversation would be Facebook, I would think. People can find me, and I always love hearing from Star Trek fans, and I'm really bummed that the Comic-Con the convention in Vegas in August got canceled, because I really love getting out there and talking to the fans, once every year or two. We all share this history together, this shared history. It's fictional, but we share it nonetheless. And it's nice to touch base with one's fellow Star Trek people, because at the end of the day, I'm a fan too.
It's we're still waiting to find out whether the UK convention is kind of going to go the same way. It's sort of it's hard to know really, but I mean it will all be temporary. Next year. If it's not this year, it'll be next year. We'll get through it. And in the meantime, when are we going to be able to see Books of Blood, and where do we look to find that?
So Books of Blood will be on Hulu or whatever Hulu is in the UK. You have Hulu? I don't know.
I don't personally. I don't think we do. I'm not sure. I may be wrong, but I mean, some of these things, there are ways of accessing them, but often I think a lot of these shows, they end up on Amazon or on Netflix or whatever over here.
Yeah, I don't. In America, it comes out in October, sometime in October.
Good time for horror.
Yes, and or what they're calling Huluween, but I don't know about the UK. I actually don't. And I really hope that it's going to air there, because, Clive Barker that's where he's from, the UK, and I would hope that that it's gonna show there in some way.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Clive Barker, I guess, best known for Hellraiser, Candyman. That was one of his as well, I think, wasn't he? But yeah, British, as you say. Well, I will investigate, and I'll certainly manage to track it down one way or another. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, this was a great conversation, Duncan. Thank you so much.
Well, it was fun talking to Brannon Braga about some of Trek's most horrific episodes this week, but that's not the only thing we've been doing on Trek FM, so here's a listen at what else you might have missed out on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm. The Line, a Star Trek Picard podcast.
Like you're saying about JL, I remember at the time reading this, Rafi calling him JL, and I remember that feeling weird to me. And like you, the first time it was in the comic, and then I was like, JL, that's kind of casual, but like you said, she kind of talks to that. But now rereading it, when I got to that, it just makes so much sense because I'm used to it now. It just seems so natural, but at the time it felt a little odd.
Earl Grey.
Is that McCoy is still alive.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes and picks up McCoy, and Scotty and McCoy have adventures throughout the galaxy in their own running.
No, then they go and find the Nexus and get Kirk back, and it's the three of them that go.
And they go to Romulus, of course, as well, to help out Spock with the reunification.
Yeah. And then they go to the Genesis planet, because obviously there's remnants of it after it blew up, and they find some Spock DNA, and they use some Borg maturation chamber to make themselves a mini Spock. But it goes wrong, so Spock is only like 6 inches tall.
Pocket Spock.
And
McCoy can put him in his pocket all the time.
I'd like, but
McCoy loved that.
It's got a wee kind of lapel pocket. Yeah, I like this, a breast pocket.
We'll call him Spocket.
Spocket in McCoy's pocket. I like that. Okay.
Primitive Culture, a look at history and culture through Star Trek.
That whole title sort of feels like the beginnings of what Roddenberry would do with Q, and having all those play on Q, basically. Yeah. Which I think had you had Mudd come back, even more. It's almost a shame that Discovery hasn't picked up that. And when they had Harry Mudd in. Yeah, exactly. They should have done that.
They resisted the temptation for the cheap. I mean, that is, as I say, there is always a temptation with these things to go for the cheap pun. Sometimes it's the right decision to resist. I don't know.
I think a cheap pun is the right call every time, Duncan, to be honest.
The Ready Room.
What does it mean to be artificial? And when you cross that barrier from being biological to being artificial, but your memories have been transferred, how much of who you are is the memory that you acquire over the course of your life, and how much of it is the biological system of your body?
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture, and that will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you can find all our details at patreon.com/TrekFM. We'd like to take a moment now to thank our associate producers on Primitive Culture, Amy Nelson, Clara Cook, and Tony Black. Amy is a presenter of many other shows on the network, and you can find her on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson. Clara and Tony were two of the former co-hosts of this show, and they'll be popping back from time to time. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC, and Tony at AJ Black Writer.
You're blended all right.